10 years of sacrifices. 0 words of gratitude. I worked double shifts so my brother could go to college. Now he won't even return my calls. They told me, "You were just doing your part." There are memories that stain the soul in a way time cannot bleach. They linger, heavy and uninvited, anchoring every breath to a version of yourself that you no longer recognize. I remember the first time I volunteered for the night shift at Milner's packing facility. The sickly sweet stench of processed meat clinging to my hair, my clothes, even my skin. I stood beneath the jaundiced flicker of fluorescent lights, my hands numb from cold and exhaustion, and I told myself this was temporary, just until Caleb got his acceptance letter, just until we could breathe easier. I tucked away my ambitions as neatly as the packages I wrapped, whispering into the abyss of machines and shouting supervisors that someday, somehow, it would all come back to me. I believed it the way children believe in magic, earnestly, blindly. I was 23 when I started patching the holes in our lives with my own flesh. Our parents, burdened by their own endless cycle of bills and blunders, had long since resigned to the notion that dreams were luxuries for other people's children. Caleb was different, though, or so I thought. He was bright, effortlessly charming, with a way of speaking that made even cynics lean in. I saw in him a chance, a fragile but dazzling sliver of hope that if I just pushed a little harder, stayed a little longer, denied myself a little more, we could escape the suffocating inertia of poverty. I traded away my nights, my weekends, my holidays, slipping further from the person I once imagined I could become. No graduations for me, no trips abroad, no golden moments captured in the glow of accomplishment. Just the ceaseless grind, the quiet gnawing ache in my back and knees, the nights I sat alone in the break room, eating stale vending machine crackers while my paycheck vaporized into tuition fees, textbook costs, endless miscellaneous charges that bled me dry one invoice at a time. In the beginning, Caleb called often. He would update me breathlessly about his classes, the quirky professors, the papers he struggled through. His voice was a balm against the bruising monotony of my existence. I held on to those conversations like precious jewels, polishing them against my chest during the hardest shifts. Sometimes he'd even say thank you, his words awkward but sincere, and I would smile into the darkness of my one-bedroom apartment, cradling the phone against my cheek as if it could somehow bridge the vast chasm of loneliness that had opened inside me. But gratitude has a half-life, and slowly those calls dwindled. At first it was understandable, midterms, internships, the frantic pace of college life. I reassured myself it was normal that he would come back around. After all, hadn't I given him everything? Hadn't I carved out his path with my own bleeding hands? So I tightened my apron, tied back my hair, and clocked in for yet another double shift, telling myself that love was not measured in reciprocation, but in the willingness to give without expecting anything in return. How naively noble that sounds now, echoing in the hollow chambers of hindsight. Months blurred into years with little more than a change in calendar themes to distinguish them. My body grew heavier, sluggish, each movement loaded with the sediment of overwork. I missed birthdays, funerals, weddings, occasions that could have been brief respites from the mechanical brutality of my life, all sacrificed on the altar of someone else's dreams. Meanwhile, Caleb thrived. His emails, when they came, were brimming with excitement about new opportunities, professors who had taken him under their wings, study groups that would sometimes stretch into nights of laughter and bonding. I clung to those fragments, rereading them until the text blurred, convincing myself that my sacrifices were not just necessary, but noble. When graduation day approached, I requested time off. My supervisor, a gaunt man with nicotine-stained fingers and a voice like crushed gravel, grudgingly approved a single unpaid day. I bought a new dress on clearance, a pale blue thing that hung awkwardly on my worn frame, but it didn't matter. I was going to see him walk across that stage, to hear his name called, to know that every blister, every lonely meal, every night spent crying into the dark, had culminated in this triumph. I stood in the roaring crowd, my hands trembling, my throat tight with unshed tears. When he stepped onto the platform, beaming victorious, my heart nearly burst with pride. I waited afterward, scanning the masses of celebrating families for his familiar face. He never came. A curt text buzzed on my phone hours later. "Sorry, got pulled into a thing with friends. Catch you later. Catch you later, as though I were an afterthought, a side character in the grand narrative of his success. I sat alone in the parking lot until the janitorial staff started giving me pitying glances. The pristine program clutched tightly in my lap, the ink smearing under the salt of my silent grief. The silence only deepened from there. Messages went unanswered. Calls rang out into oblivion. I began to feel like a ghost haunting a life I had helped build, but no longer had any place within. Eventually, desperation drove me to our parents. I sat across from them at the battered kitchen table of our childhood home, the same one where we once planned imaginary adventures and whispered our secrets into the cracked linoleum floor. I poured out my heart, the sleepless nights, the relentless work, the aching loneliness, all of it spilling like blood from a fresh wound. I waited, trembling, for some kind of validation, some sliver of acknowledgment that my sacrifices had mattered. They exchanged a glance, weary and dismissive, before my father shrugged and said the words that would carve themselves into my bones forever. You were just doing your part. Just doing my part. As though years of breaking myself against the jagged cliffs of necessity were no more significant than setting the table or taking out the trash. As though the hollow spaces inside me, the dreams abandoned and the health forfeited, were nothing more than the natural order of things. My mother nodded in agreement, her face impassive, already turning back to her soap opera, the volume swallowing my devastation. I left the house that evening with no intention of ever returning. I walked the cracked sidewalks of our neighborhood until the streetlights buzzed to life, each one flickering uncertainly in the dusky gloom. I walked until my feet bled, until the world blurred into a haze of neon and shadows, until I could almost forget the hollow ache that had replaced my heart. In the days that followed, a grim clarity settled over me. I realized that love, when given without boundaries, becomes invisible. I realized that sacrifice, when expected rather than appreciated, turns into something grotesque and thankless. I realized that sometimes, family is just another word for obligation, a chain that chokes rather than comforts. And I began to wonder what it would feel like to live for myself. The world had not changed, but somehow it looked unfamiliar to me. The streets I once knew intimately had grown foreign overnight, as though shedding the skin of our shared history in favor of a newer, colder veneer. I wandered them with no destination, a specter cloaked in resentment and confusion, the weight of years pressing so heavily against my shoulders that my very posture had altered, stooping me into someone unrecognizable. The faint neon of cheap diners and 24-hour laundromats cast sickly halos onto the cracked concrete, and I watched my shadow stretch grotesquely across the ground, a dark smear that felt more like my true self than the body moving beneath it. The apartment welcomed me back with the same cold indifference it always had. The air was stale, carrying the faint undertone of fried oil and the metallic tang of loneliness. I tossed my bag into a corner and collapsed onto the threadbare couch, staring at the ceiling fan that whined weakly as it spun, its slow rotations a mockery of time's relentless march. The silence pressed against my ears until I thought I might scream just to break it. But there was no one to hear. There had never been anyone to hear. Not really. In the days that followed, I moved mechanically, performing the rituals of existence without thought or emotion. Work remained a constant, though even that felt hollower now, the endless shifts blending into one another like watercolors left out in the rain. I showed up, punched in, wrapped my hands in coarse gloves, and fell into the numbing rhythm of labor. My co-workers had long since stopped asking questions about the dark circles under my eyes or the slump in my shoulders. In a place like Milner's, misery was a common language, spoken fluently by all. Each morning, I returned home to an inbox empty of messages, a phone devoid of calls, a life stripped of connection. Caleb's absence was a wound that refused to scab over, raw and weeping beneath every mundane activity. I stalked his social media accounts in moments of weakness, a self-inflicted cruelty that left me gasping in the wake of each smiling photo, each celebratory caption penned without a second thought for the sister who had given up everything for him. He traveled now, New York, London, Tokyo, his world expanding in all directions while mine shrank into a suffocating singularity. One evening, long after the sun had surrendered to the smothering cloak of night, I found myself standing outside a cafe I used to pass by without so much as a glance. The windows glowed invitingly, and the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses leaked out onto the street. My reflection in the glass was a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, wearing clothes that hung limply from a frame wasted by neglect. For reasons I could not articulate, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warmth was immediate, almost offensive in its contrast to the chill that had settled into my bones. I slid onto a stool at the far end of the bar, away from the clusters of students and young professionals who spoke in exuberant, careless tones, their lives seemingly untouched by the kind of sacrifices that had devoured me. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a kind face, approached and wordlessly placed a glass of water in front of me. I stared at it for a long moment before ordering a drink I barely tasted. Hours blurred into each other as I sat there, nursing one glass after another, the alcohol numbing the sharper edges of my grief but doing nothing to fill the cavernous emptiness inside me. Eventually, the bartender leaned in and said something. A question, perhaps, but I couldn't focus on the words. I slid from the stool, nearly losing my balance, and stumbled out into the night. The walk home was a disjointed, stumbling affair, the world tilting alarmingly with every step. I collapsed onto my bed fully clothed, the room spinning around me, and after a long while, I wept openly, great heaving sobs that racked my body until sleep mercifully claimed me. When I woke, my mouth was dry, my head pounding, but a strange clarity had settled over me. The realization was stark and undeniable. No one was coming to save me. There would be no grand apology, no tearful reunion, no vindication for the years lost. If I wanted anything resembling a life, I would have to carve it out myself, claw it from the indifferent world with bloodied hands if necessary. The thought was as terrifying as it was liberating. I began small, almost tentatively, like a prisoner taking cautious steps into the open air after decades of confinement. I cleaned the apartment after months, scrubbing away layers of neglect with a ferocity that left my muscles screaming. I threw away the ratty furniture, the remnants of a life lived in service to someone else's dreams. In their place, I bought a second-hand desk and a battered laptop, investments in a future that was mine alone. Nights were the hardest. They stretched on endlessly, filled with echoes of old conversations and the gnawing loneliness that clung to me like a second skin. I took to walking again, not aimless meandering, but deliberate, purposeful strides through unfamiliar neighborhoods. I found solace in the anonymity of city streets, the hum of distant traffic, the flicker of lives being lived without me. Each step was a silent declaration. I exist. I matter. Even if no one else sees it. I enrolled in night classes at the community college, using the paltry savings I had managed to scrape together. The idea of sitting in a classroom again was both thrilling and terrifying. The first time I walked into a lecture hall, my hands trembled so violently that I had to clench them into fists to keep from bolting. The professor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a voice like honey over gravel, spoke passionately about literature, about the power of words to shape worlds, to dismantle and rebuild realities. I clung to every syllable, drinking them in like a starving thing. There were setbacks, of course. Moments when the enormity of starting over threatened to crush me. I failed my first midterm spectacularly, my mind clouded with self-doubt and residual grief. There were nights when I sat hunched over my desk, tears blurring the text, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake, if I was too broken, too old, too stupid to salvage anything of worth from the wreckage of my life. But I pressed on. Each small victory, a passing grade, a paper praised, a fleeting smile from a classmate, was a stitch in the ragged fabric of my new existence. Slowly, painfully, I began to reconstruct myself, not into the person I once was, but into someone tougher, sharper, someone who had gazed into the abyss and decided to build a bridge across it rather than fall. One afternoon, months after I had begun this halting resurrection, I saw Caleb's name flash across my phone screen. My heart leapt into my throat, a pathetic, involuntary reaction, and I hesitated for a long moment before answering. "Hey," his voice said, casual, as though no time had passed at all. "How's it going?" I swallowed the bitter words that rose immediately to my lips. "Busy," I said shortly. There was a pause, the faint sound of background laughter filtering through. "Yeah, same here. Listen, I'm going to be in town next week. Maybe we could grab coffee or something." The audacity of it stunned me into silence. After years of abandonment, he expected a warm welcome, a seamless return to a relationship he had carelessly discarded. I realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he had not changed. He still expected me to be there, to pick up the pieces, to offer unconditional love without accountability. "I don't think so," I said finally, my voice steady. Another pause, longer this time. "Seriously?" he said, a hint of incredulous laughter threading through his words. "Seriously," I replied. "I'm busy." He muttered something, an insult, or maybe just a curse, before the line went dead. I stared at the blank screen for a long moment, a strange mixture of sadness and triumph warring inside me. The sadness would pass, I knew. The triumph would remain. Weeks passed. I kept my head down, working, studying, building a life brick by painstaking brick. The bitterness did not vanish overnight, but it softened, worn down by the relentless grind of self-determination. I no longer checked Caleb's social media. I no longer waited for calls that would never come. Instead, I started to imagine futures that belonged solely to me. Quiet ones, perhaps, but free and unshackled by the crushing weight of unreciprocated devotion. One evening, as the city buzzed with the electric anticipation of a summer storm, I sat in a small cafe near campus, scribbling notes into a battered notebook. The door swung open, and a gust of rain-scented wind swept in, carrying with it a murmur of laughter, the clatter of shoes on tile. I looked up briefly and then returned to my work, heart steady, mind clear. I was no longer a ghost haunting the ruins of someone else's life. I was something new, something stronger, and I was truly, gloriously alone, but not lonely. It was a year later when the final severing of old ties came, not with the drama I had always unconsciously anticipated, but with a quiet so profound it bordered on holy. Life had become an intricate tapestry, woven from the thin, strong threads of self-discipline and a stubborn kind of hope. I had finished my first full year of night classes, scrabbling together a modest but undeniable academic standing that would soon open the door to a proper degree. Work remained a necessity, of course, though no longer the soul-shattering chain it once had been. I had found a position in a small bookstore across town, where the scent of paper and ink replaced the cloying reek of industrial decay, and where my hands moved not to package meat, but to shelve volumes filled with ideas, stories, and possibilities. Each day was a deliberate choice rather than an endless sentence, and with every sunrise, the person I used to be grew more distant, less real, until she seemed a myth I could scarcely believe I had once embodied. My parents, true to form, reached out only sporadically, and when they did, it was with the same entitled expectation that had once governed every interaction. A birthday call made obligatory by calendar reminders, a brief inquiry into my financial situation masked poorly by superficial pleasantries. I answered less and less frequently. Each ignored call another quiet rebellion, another brick in the wall I had learned to build around myself. The guilt that once gnawed at me during these acts of refusal had dulled, reduced to a faint itch easily scratched away. Love, I had come to understand, should not be paid for in suffering. It should not demand the slow erosion of one's own spirit. It was late autumn when Caleb appeared again, not through a text or a call this time, but in the flesh, standing awkwardly in the entrance of the bookstore as I rang up a customer. He looked different, older, but somehow more brittle, the youthful shine of ambition tarnished by some private disillusionment. His suit, once a marker of his ascent into the professional world, hung slightly loose on his frame, and there were faint shadows beneath his eyes that no amount of charm could mask. I saw all this in an instant, catalogued it, and felt nothing but a detached curiosity, as one might feel upon encountering a figure from a dream long forgotten. He waited until the store emptied, hovering uncertainly by the magazine rack, pretending to browse while sneaking glances in my direction. When at last the final customer drifted out into the cool evening air, he approached, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his coat. "Hey," he said, his voice strained, brittle. I looked at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch taut between us. "Hey," I replied, my tone carefully neutral. He shifted from foot to foot, glancing around as if seeking an escape route. "Can we talk?" I gestured to a pair of worn armchairs tucked into a corner of the store. a makeshift reading nook I had claimed as my own small sanctuary. We sat, the air between us thick with things unspoken. "I messed up," he said finally, his voice low. "I know I haven't been there. I know I hurt you. I don't even know where to start making it right." The words hung there, heavy, vulnerable, but they did not have the impact he seemed to expect. I watched him, studied the way his hands trembled slightly, the way his gaze darted away from mine. Once, not so long ago, I would have leapt at this opportunity, grasped it with both hands, desperate to heal the rift, to believe that love could patch over betrayal, if only given enough will. But now, all I felt was a quiet sadness, not for the relationship that had crumbled, but for the years I had wasted believing that blood alone could sustain a bond. "You can't make it right," I said, not unkindly. "Some things can't be undone." He flinched as if struck, but said nothing. I leaned back in the chair, feeling an unfamiliar calm settle over me. "You needed me to build you up," I continued, my voice steady. "And when you no longer needed what I had to give, you left. You didn't just leave me behind. You erased me." Tears welled in his eyes, but I felt no satisfaction in the sight. Pity, perhaps, but even that was muted. "I was selfish," he whispered. "I was stupid." "Yes," I said simply. He sagged in his chair, defeated. For a moment, I thought he might cry, and I wondered if he was mourning me, or simply the easy support he had taken for granted. It didn't matter anymore. "I don't hate you," I said after a moment. "But I can't give you any more of me. I don't have anything left to spare." He nodded slowly, accepting the verdict even if he could not yet comprehend its full finality. We sat there a while longer, two strangers bound only by shared history, until at last he rose to his feet. "Goodbye," he said, voice cracking. "Goodbye," I echoed, and he left. The door swung shut behind him with a soft chime, and with it, the last remnants of the life I had once thought I needed. In the weeks that followed, I found myself breathing easier. The absence of expectation, the final severing of those old, constricting ties, was a liberation I had not dared even to dream of. I poured myself into my studies, into the small joys of my new life, discovering a hidden coffee shop tucked between two derelict buildings, losing myself in books that spoke to the buried parts of my soul, sharing tentative smiles and brief conversations with classmates who knew nothing of the sacrifices that had shaped me, but valued me nonetheless for the person I was now becoming. I graduated 2 years later, a small ceremony held on the sun-drenched lawn of the community college. There were no banners, no elaborate celebrations, no family members waving frantically from the crowd. Just me, standing proudly in a simple cap and gown, holding a diploma that represented not just academic achievement, but survival, resilience, rebirth. Afterward, I took myself out to dinner at a modest Italian restaurant, savoring a meal free of the bitter aftertaste of obligation. I raised a glass of cheap wine and a silent toast, not to Caleb, not to my parents, not even to the lost years, but to the woman who had clawed her way out of despair, who had chosen, finally and irrevocably, herself. Life did not transform overnight into something storybook perfect. There were still hard days, still nights when loneliness crept in around the edges, but there was a strength within me now that could not be undone by mere absence or neglect. I had learned the most painful lesson of all, that love, given without expectation of return, was noble, but love hoarded selfishly by others was a poison. I moved to a different city shortly after graduation, drawn by a job offer at a small publishing house that valued passion over pedigree. My apartment was tiny, the wallpaper peeling in places, but it was mine. Every creak of the floorboards, every uneven shelf, was a testament to the life I had built with my own 2 hands. Years later, when I thought of Caleb, it was with a distant sort of affection, the way one might remember a childhood friend who moved away and never wrote. The anger had faded into something softer, almost tender, a scar that no longer ached with every movement. I never heard from him again, and I was at peace with that, because in the end, my life had never truly belonged to him or to anyone else. It belonged to me.